At 11:47 on the morning of October 13th, 1942, Captain Chet Varro sat in the cockpit of a machine that smelled like a swamp, flew like a brick, and was, by every official measure the United States Navy could apply, already dead. The air over Guadalcanal was not really air. It was heat and rot and moisture pressed together into something thick enough to chew. It carried the smell of jungle decay, of aviation fuel baked by a tropical sun, of thousands of Marines who hadn't seen a bar of soap in 2 months. It poured through every gap and crack in the cockpit, and the cockpit of Chet Varro's F-4F Wildcat had plenty of both. He sat with an unlit cigar clamped between his teeth. Not smoking it, just holding it. He had learned early on that the cigar was something to bite down on when the instrument panel started lying to him, which it did often. The oil pressure gauge flickered between acceptable and alarming without ever settling on either. The fuel read lower than it should have for a plane sitting still on the ground. The temperature needle had been stuck at the same position for 4 days, which Sergeant Earl Pruitt said was either because the engine was running perfectly or because the gauge itself had given up caring. Varro tapped the temperature gauge with one knuckle. It didn't move. He bit down on the cigar and accepted this as a reasonable way to begin a Tuesday. Outside the cockpit, Henderson Field sprawled in every direction like something a man had started building and then walked away from in disgust. The runway was a strip of dirt and crushed coral that shook the teeth out of your head on landing and sent rocks rattling against the undercarriage on takeoff. Bomb craters filled with red mud lined the edges like pockmarks on a sick face. The operations shack was a plywood box with a corrugated tin roof that leaked in 3 places and amplified the rain into something close to artillery. The control tower, if you were generous enough to call it that, was a wooden platform on stilts with a radio set and a man with binoculars. Along the tree line sat the boneyard. That was the name the mechanics had given to the graveyard of aircraft that hadn't made it back, and it had grown considerably since August. Fuselages split open like cracked eggs, tail sections bent at angles no engineer had designed for, propeller blades twisted into shapes that looked like modern sculpture if you squinted and tried to find something hopeful in it, wings stripped of their skin, ribs exposed to the rain, engines pulled and catalogued and stacked according to what was salvageable and what was not. The boneyard was where planes went when they were done being planes, and it was the first thing you saw when you taxied to the runway and the last thing you saw when you lined up on final approach coming home. Parts from those dead planes were on Varro's aircraft. He knew this because Earl Pruitt had told him in the flat and unhurried way. Pruitt told him everything, standing in the pre-dawn dark with a flashlight held at waist height, going through the list without editorial comment because editorial comment was not something Pruitt did. The left aileron had come off a plane that went down near Savo Island 3 weeks ago. The tail section was from a Wildcat that had caught fire on landing and burned to the wing roots before the foam crew got to it. 2 of the 6 machine guns had been pulled from wrecks and rebuilt from mixed components by a mechanic named Weller, who was 20 years old and from Ohio and had a gift for it. The landing gear hydraulics had been repaired 4 separate times in the last 6 days. Pruitt had delivered all of this information without changing his expression once. Then he had patted the fuselage once with the flat of his hand, the way a man checks a fence post to see if it will hold, and walked away to get his coffee. Chet Varro was 27 years old. He had grown up on a farm outside of Aberdeen, South Dakota, where the winters arrived without announcement and the soil pushed back against the plow, and the men who worked it learned early that the land did not respond to argument or complaint, only to work. His father had fixed every piece of equipment on that farm himself, from combines to irrigation pumps to a truck engine that had been declared dead by 2 mechanics before his father took it apart on a Saturday morning and put it back together by Sunday night. Varro had learned to fly in a rented Piper Cub over flat prairie fields, paying for the hours by working a feed store after school, and the first time the wheels had left the ground, he had understood that this was the thing he had been waiting to find his whole life without knowing he was looking for it. He had a round face that read younger than it was and eyes that read older, and when he smiled, which was less frequent now than it had been in August, there was still something in it that made the younger pilots feel like the situation might not be entirely hopeless. This morning he was not smiling. He was sitting in the cockpit of a plane the Navy wanted to bury on an island the Navy had already abandoned, thinking about a piece of paper he had read 2 hours ago in the operations shack while rain hammered the tin roof above him. Major Gil Tanner had placed it on the table without speaking. Tanner was a lean man with deep-set eyes and the permanent expression of someone working through a problem that did not have a clean answer. He was the kind of officer who told you the truth even when the truth required him to stand in the same room with it, which was not as common a quality as it should have been. The paper was a Navy Department analysis, stamped 3 days earlier in Washington, prepared by engineers and operations analysts who worked in offices with electric lighting and running water and access to performance data from across the Pacific Theater. The language was measured and technical and completely clear. The loss rates of the F-4F Wildcat in combat operations against the Mitsubishi Zero were unsustainable. The performance differential between the two aircraft in speed, climb rate, turn radius, and operational ceiling was too significant to be offset by pilot skill or tactical adaptation. The recommendation, placed in the third paragraph with the careful burial technique that bureaucracies use for conclusions they know will not be welcomed, was to consider transitioning the Wildcat out of frontline fighter operations in favor of aircraft with superior performance characteristics. In plain language, the men in Washington had run the numbers and decided the Wildcat was a losing proposition. Varro had read it twice. He had set it back on the table. He had looked at Tanner, who was looking at the wall behind Varro's left shoulder, with the expression of a man who has already decided that whatever comes next is going to come next, regardless of how he feels about it. Tanner had said, "Radar's got something. Be on the strip in 40 minutes. Then he had folded the paper back into his breast pocket and walked out into the rain. Varro had sat alone with the empty table for a moment. The Navy's own engineers had written off the plane he was about to climb into, had looked at the record of men not returning, and decided the machine was not worth the cost. He understood the logic. He could not argue with the conclusion. But the conclusion did not account for the fact that there was nothing else to fly, and there were 30,000 Japanese soldiers in the jungle surrounding this airfield, and the Marine infantry holding the perimeter were sick and hungry and running on 2 meals a day and waiting for the Cactus Air Force to keep the sky above their heads from becoming a delivery system for bombs. There was no superior aircraft waiting in a hangar somewhere. There was what was here. And what was here was a collection of machines that Washington had already marked for replacement, kept in the air by mechanics who slept 3 hours a night and performed what amounted to mechanical surgery in the tropical dark using parts stripped from planes that had already died. He had put on his parachute harness and walked to the flight line. Earl Pruitt was at the nose of the plane. He was somewhere in the hard country between 40 and 50, with hands that looked like they had been made from a different material than hands usually were, and a face that operated on strict economy, nothing visible on it that wasn't strictly necessary. He had been maintaining aircraft longer than some of the pilots on this island had been alive. He treated every machine he touched with a combination of professional contempt and deep personal investment that made no logical sense until you had watched him work for long enough to understand that for Pruitt, the plane was the work, and the work was everything. He handed Varro a rag without being asked. He said, "Cylinder 4 was running rough. I adjusted the timing last night. Should hold." Varro said, "Should." Pruitt said, "Should." He pulled the wheel chock away. "Radio's going to cut out above 15,000. Tap the bracket on the left side twice and it usually comes back." Varro had learned to take these reports without asking the follow-up questions that came naturally to mind, because the follow-up questions led to answers that did not change what happened next. What happened next was that he climbed into the plane and flew it, regardless of what the cylinder was doing or what the radio intended. Asking Pruitt how bad the underlying situation was only added weight to something that was already heavy enough. He climbed the wing and settled into the cockpit. Pruitt stood at the wing root. He did not say, "Be careful." He did not say, "Come home safe." The way the movies said men said these things before combat missions. He said, "She's heavy today. Don't go for altitude before you've got airspeed." Then he stepped back to a position where he could watch the engine start without being in the propeller arc, and his face held the particular quality of a man who has done everything within his power to prepare the situation and is now required to wait and see what the situation does with his preparation. Down the revetment, Lieutenant Birch Talley was climbing into his own Wildcat. Talley was 22 years old and from a town in Georgia small enough that he always had to explain where it was near rather than what it was called. He had come to this island with something still intact in his face that 3 months of daily combat had filed down without entirely removing, a quality of not yet knowing that sat in his expression alongside everything he had already learned. He caught Varro's eye across the distance and produced the half-grin, the version that Guadalcanal had reduced from what it used to be, and pointed 2 fingers at the sky. Varro pointed back and turned to his instruments. The Pratt & Whitney engine caught on the second attempt with a sound like a large dog eating gravel from a metal bowl, settled into an idle that shook the entire airframe and gradually found something resembling a rhythm. Varro let it warm while he ran his checks. Magnetos, fuel pressure, control surfaces, the ailerons and elevator moving through their range with the stiffness of a machine that had been repaired too many times in conditions that were not designed for repair. He pushed the throttle forward. The Wildcat was not a machine that inspired confidence from the outside. It was short and wide and sat low on thick landing gear that gave it a crouching posture. Its nose was blunt and its body was wide, and when it moved on the ground it did so with a side-to-side roll that the mechanics called the Grumman waddle, a name that contained within it everything the plane was and was not. It displaced air through determined insistence rather than any pretense of grace. In the training manuals it was described as rugged. By the pilots who flew it daily against the Zero it was called the Tub, which was an affectionate name in the way that nicknames for difficult things are sometimes affectionate, carrying within them the specific warmth of having survived something together. The Zero it was fighting was something else entirely. The Mitsubishi Zero was a machine built from a different philosophy, one that had decided the highest form of a fighter was one in which nothing existed that was not essential to speed and maneuverability, and had followed that philosophy to its logical conclusion with extraordinary discipline. It was fast in the way that a thrown object is fast, clean through the air, turning on command with a responsiveness that American pilots had encountered for the first time over Pearl Harbor, and had not stopped thinking about since. It climbed like it was trying to get away from the ground. In a turning fight, a Zero pilot could put his aircraft anywhere he needed it to be with an ease that made the Wildcat feel like it was asking permission first. The Japanese knew this. They had broken into marine radio frequencies on more than one occasion to say so. They had called the Wildcat pilots orphans in their own language, and then in English, knowing the Americans were listening, they had told the Marines that no one was coming to rescue them, that the island would be their grave, that the Tub was a target, and everyone in it was already dead. They had said these things with the confidence of people who had looked at the performance charts and found the conclusion self-evident. The wheels left the dirt, and Varro felt the familiar lurch as the landing gear came up with its habitual complaint, a mechanical shudder through the fuselage that never entirely felt like it was going to stop being a shudder and start being something worse. Then the island dropped away and there was sky. At 12,000 feet the radio cut out. He tapped the bracket. It came back. Tally's Wildcat climbed alongside him to the left, paint worn back to bare metal along the wing leading edges, a long repair scar across the tail from a cannon, round 2 weeks prior, that the mechanics had addressed with sheet aluminum and sealant and declared flight-worthy in the particular way they declared everything flight-worthy on this island, which was to say they had done what they could and the rest was between the plane and its pilot. 2 more Wildcats came up behind them, exhausts trailing thin threads of black against the blue. At 20,000 feet, Varro saw the Japanese formation. They caught the sunlight before they resolved into individual shapes, silver flashes in the deep blue that became, as his eyes adjusted, a disciplined arrangement of aircraft flying with the ease of a force that expects no meaningful opposition. Bombers in a clean V formation at the center, Zeros ranging wide on the flanks, weaving in long, unhurried arcs, the patrol pattern of escorts who are present as a formality rather than a necessity, the kind of formation that speaks to fuel, to numbers, to the institutional confidence of a military that has been winning. He counted the zeros until counting felt beside the point and stopped. He keyed the radio. He said, "Tally-ho, Tally, take the right flank. I've got the lead bomber." Tally's voice came back level. "Copy, Skipper." And the plan was the only plan that worked, and they both knew it. You did not turn with a zero. You did not try to climb with a zero. You did not give them the kind of fight they had prepared for, the wheeling aerial duel where the more agile aircraft always held the advantage, and the Zero was more agile than anything else in the sky over this ocean. What you did was point your nose at them and commit. You used the weight of the tub as a weapon. You let the heavy, slow, officially written-off machine trade altitude for speed until the dump truck became a falling piano, and you flew it straight at the enemy formation and you did not pull away. Varro rolled the Wildcat inverted and dove. 2 Zeros broke from the escort pattern immediately to intercept, rolling toward him with their noses tracking his descent, and he saw the wing guns flash as they opened fire. The impacts came in quick succession, a series of hard metallic blows across the fuselage and wings, and then a heavier sound from directly behind his head as something struck the steel plate bolted behind the pilot's seat and rang it like a bell being struck with a hammer. He did not pull out. He flew into it. This was Twist 1 come alive. This was what the men in Washington had not calculated for, because it was not on any performance chart they had prepared. The plate behind Varro's seat weighed considerably more than the Zero's engineers had ever considered putting in their aircraft, because the Zero's engineers had made a different decision at a fundamental level. They had traded protection for performance. They had removed every ounce of weight that was not directly related to speed and maneuverability, which meant they had removed the armor that would have kept the pilot alive after being hit, and the armored glass that would have kept bullets out of the cockpit, and the systems that would have kept the fuel tanks from becoming incendiary devices when punctured. A Zero was a precision instrument. It was also, underneath the elegance, a machine with no tolerance for damage. The Zero pilots opened fire again, and Varro heard the rounds coming through the fuselage skin in 2 places and felt a vibration begin in the left wing that had not been there before, and the armor plate rang twice more in quick succession, and none of it killed him, because of the tanks. The F-4F Wildcat's fuel tanks were lined with a layer of raw rubber on the interior walls. When a bullet punched through, the aviation fuel that leaked into contact with the rubber caused a chemical reaction, the rubber swelling outward into the hole, sealing it. Not perfectly, not permanently, but well enough. The principle was not sophisticated. It was the kind of solution that a practical man working a practical problem arrives at when the objective is not elegance but survival. When a Zero's bullet hit Varro's fuel tank, the tank did not ignite. It sealed itself and kept flying. Varro pressed the trigger, and his 6 guns fired in a sound less like individual weapons and more like something being torn at high speed, and his tracers walked across the nearest Zero's fuselage toward the wing route and found the main spar, which had no armor around it and no redundancy built into it, because redundancy weighed something and weight had been the enemy of everything the Zero's designers had valued. The wings separated. The Zero came apart in a bloom of fire and aluminum that expanded and then dissipated almost instantly in the slipstream, and Varro flew through the outer edge of the debris cloud and felt pieces of the destroyed aircraft striking his wings and a smear of oil cross his windscreen and pulled back hard on the stick. The Wildcat climbed. It climbed with effort, the way it always climbed, arguing with gravity every foot of the way. The engine was running hot. The left wing vibration had not resolved. There were holes in the fuselage that had not been there 20 minutes ago. The armor plate behind his head had taken 4 rounds that would have otherwise found the back of his skull. He leveled off and looked out at the sky around him. The Japanese formation had broken. Bombers scattering without the disciplined V they had arrived in. Zeros turning to engage, some of them pulling into climbs that would bring them down from above, the preferred attack angle, the one that gave them every advantage. Varro checked his fuel, he checked his guns, he looked at the oil smear on his windscreen and looked through it at the bombers below him that were still heading for Henderson Field, for the Marines on the perimeter, for everything down there that could not defend itself from above. He pushed the nose over and dove again. The tub that would not die was just getting started. The Japanese were punctual. You could set your watch by them, and the Marines at Henderson Field had learned to do exactly that. Every day at noon, the Tokyo Express came down the slot from Rabaul, and every day the Cactus Air Force went up to meet it, and every day the ratio was the same. More of them than us, better planes than ours, and yet somehow, at the end of each day, the airfield was still there. But the Japanese were patient in the way that large forces can afford to be patient. They had been embarrassed in the air, so they decided to settle the matter from the sea. Chet Varro was in his cot at 01:33 on the morning of October 14th when the world ended. He did not hear the shells coming. The first thing he heard was the impact, a sound so large it was not really a sound at all, but a physical event, a compression of air that hit him in the chest before the noise registered in his ears. He was off the cot and moving before he was fully awake, instinct pulling him toward the entrance of the dugout while his mind was still assembling the information. Outside, Henderson Field was on fire. The battleships Congo and Haruna had positioned themselves off the coast in the dark, and their 14-inch guns were now delivering a lesson in the difference between air power and naval power. A 14-inch shell weighs as much as a compact automobile. It does not pierce a target so much as it erases it. The Japanese fired 900 of them over the next 90 minutes, and each one that hit the airfield deleted a piece of it from existence. Varro made it 20 feet toward the flight line before Major Gil Tanner grabbed him by the arm and pulled him back. Tanner said, "There's nothing to save out there right now." Varro said, "The planes," Tanner said, "get in the hole, Chet." He said it the way a man says something he has already decided is not a request, and Varro got in the hole. The dugout was 6 feet deep and covered with sandbags and corrugated metal that felt entirely inadequate against what was happening above it. 8 men sat in the dark with their knees pulled up and their hands over their ears while the ground shook in continuous waves. The aviation fuel dump went up 20 minutes into the bombardment, a detonation that sent a column of fire high enough to be seen from ships 12 miles away, and the light from it leaked down through the gaps in the sandbags and painted the men in the hole in pulsing orange. Nobody spoke. There was nothing useful to say. Varro sat with his back against the dirt wall and listened to his airplanes being destroyed above him. Somewhere during the second hour he thought about Earl Pruitt. Pruitt was not in the dugout. Varro had registered this in the first minutes without fully processing it, the way you notice an empty chair at a table before you think to ask where the person went. He looked around the faces in the pulsing orange light. Tanner. Tally, white-faced and still. 3 other pilots he knew. 2 ordnance men, not Pruitt. He told himself Pruitt had found another hole. There were other dugouts on the field. Pruitt was a man who had been doing this long enough to know where to go when the world started coming apart. He was fine. Varro bit down on his unlit cigar and watched the sandbag ceiling shake and told himself this until the guns stopped. The silence that followed the bombardment was its own kind of violence. The ears had been so full of noise for so long that the absence of it felt wrong, felt like a held breath. Men came out of holes all across the airfield and stood in the pre-dawn dark and looked at what was left. Henderson Field looked like the surface of the moon. The flight line was cratered. 3 revetments had taken direct hits and the planes inside them were gone. Not damaged, but gone, replaced by smoking holes in the earth. Twisted aluminum lay scattered across the coral. The fuel dump was still burning. The control tower had been reduced to a pile of planks. Varro walked the line, counting. 4 Wildcats were not obviously destroyed. 3 were damaged in ways he could not immediately assess in the dark. 1, parked in the farthest revetment and sheltered by a low earthen berm, looked intact. Canopy cracked, paint scorched, shrapnel in the left wing that would need to come out. But the engine, when a mechanic checked it, had not been touched. He looked for Pruitt. He asked a ground crewman named Weller, a 20-year-old from Ohio who knew every mechanic on the field by name. Weller looked at the ground for a moment and then looked back up and said it straight, because there was no kind way to say it. Pruitt had been in the hangar. He had not gone to the dugout when the shelling started because he had been in the middle of replacing the cylinder 4 assembly on Varro's engine, a job that was halfway done when the first shell hit. And Earl Pruitt was not a man who left a job halfway done. Weller said this without embellishment, the way the dead are described by people who knew them best, through the last thing they did. Varro stood with this for a long moment. Then Weller held out a piece of paper. Folded and left on the forward cowling of Varro's plane, tucked under the engine access panel where it would stay dry. Written in pencil in Pruitt's cramped economical handwriting, the handwriting of a man who had never wasted anything in his life, including words, it said, "Cylinder 4 fixed. Don't waste it. No name, no date, no farewell." Just the information and the instruction, because Earl Pruitt had fixed the problem and communicated what needed to be communicated and then gone back to work. Varro folded the paper once and put it in the breast pocket of his flight suit, against his chest. He pressed his hand flat against the outside of the pocket for a moment and felt the paper through the fabric. Then the radar shack called in a contact. 50+ aircraft inbound, bearing north-northwest. Estimated time of arrival, 22 minutes. Tanner appeared at his shoulder. He said, "I've got 4 planes that can get airborne, maybe, and about 8 pilots who can stand up straight." Varro said, "I need fuel." Tanner said, "The main pump is gone. You'd have to hand carry it from the reserve drums." Varro said, "Then we carry it." He turned and looked at Birch Talley, who was standing 10 feet away with smoke on his face and his helmet hanging from his hand. Talley was not grinning with half his mouth this morning. He was simply looking at Varro the way a young man looks at someone when he needs to know what happens next. Varro said, "Get the others, tell them we're going up." What followed was not a military operation, it was a junkyard resurrection. They hand-carried aviation fuel in 5-gallon cans from the reserve drums at the far end of the field, filling tanks by bucket and funnel while aftershocks from the bombardment were still rolling through the ground. They pulled shrapnel from the wing of the 3rd Wildcat with pliers while the engine was warming up. The battery cart that started the engines had been destroyed, so they hand-cranked the starters, 2 men on each crank turning hard in the hot morning air until the engines caught. Tanner stood at the edge of the runway and watched all of this. When Varro taxied past him in the last plane, Tanner said something into the radio. Varro's set cut it to static, but Talley heard it and reported it afterward. Tanner had said, very quietly, "That's not a squadron, that's a funeral." He had not said it to anyone in particular. He had said it to the air, the way a man speaks when he wants the record to reflect that he understood what he was watching. Varro taxied around a fresh crater, clipped the corner of a sandbag wall with his left wingtip, corrected, and pushed the throttle to the stop. The Wildcat lifted off trailing dust and exhaust, and Varro pulled back hard and climbed, the engine doing what Pruitt had stayed up all night to make it do, the cylinder 4 assembly running clean and strong and exactly as intended. At 15,000 feet, he looked left and right and counted 4 planes, 4 cracked canopies and scorched paint and shrapnel holes climbing into the sky to meet what the radar said was 50-plus aircraft. He saw the formation at 20,000 feet. The Japanese bombers were flying low and loose, the confident posture of a force that believed the airfield below had been neutralized. Their Zero escorts wove in wide, unhurried arcs. Nobody in that formation was afraid of anything. Varro watched them for 3 seconds and then tipped his nose over and dove. At 400 miles per hour, the Wildcat stopped being a slow, ugly, officially condemned fighter and became a very specific kind of problem for whatever it was pointed at. Varro lined up on the lead bomber and fired at 200 yards and watched his rounds walk through the left wing root. The wing folded. The plane went straight down. He pulled up hard and rolled to find the next target, and that was when he saw the Zero coming down from above and behind in the ideal firing solution. The Zero pilot opened fire. Varro felt the impacts across the top of the fuselage, felt the armor plate ring twice in quick succession, felt something hit the left wing hard enough to kick the whole plane sideways. He did not brake. He kept his nose on the bomber below and fired again. The Zero fired again. More hits, more ringing from the armor plate, a new vibration in the airframe that had not been there before. The Wildcat did not catch fire. Did. The Zero fired a third burst, and then something happened that Tally witnessed from 200 yards and described afterward with the precision of a man who needs to be believed about something that sounds improbable. The Zero broke off, not because it had run out of ammunition, not because it had been hit. It broke off and turned away and climbed hard, as if the act of repeatedly hitting an airplane that refused to fall had crossed some internal threshold the pilot had not known he possessed until he reached it. Tally's voice came over the radio. He said, "Skipper." He just turned away. "They're scared of us." Varro said, "Good." The engine running clean on Pruitt's cylinder. The paper against his chest. "Keep going." The battle lasted 40 minutes. The Japanese formation commander would describe the result in his report as unexpected. 4 American fighters, visibly damaged from the previous night's bombardment, had disrupted the bombing run, destroyed multiple aircraft, and refused every tactical invitation to engage in the kind of turning fight that should have ended them in minutes. They had flown like men with nothing left to lose, which was exactly what they were. When Varro brought his plane down and cut the engine and the silence came back, he sat in the cockpit without moving. The smell of hot metal and oil was everywhere, and under it the faint trace of Pruitt's hands, the particular residue of work done by someone who knew what he was doing. Tanner appeared at the wing root and looked up. He said, "4 confirmed today." Varro climbed out. His legs were unsteady on the wing and he held the canopy rail until they found themselves. He said, "How's Tally?" Tanner said, "Shaken, but fine." Varro nodded and looked down the flight line at the scorched, battered remnants of the Cactus Air Force. He thought about the Zero that had turned away and what it means when the man trying to kill you starts to hesitate. That gap, narrow as it was the only gap that mattered. Tomorrow would be worse. The mathematics said so. The intelligence report said so. Varro bit down on his unlit cigar and started walking. The math had been wrong before. November came to Guadalcanal the way everything came to Guadalcanal, which was without asking and without mercy. The malaria that had been working through the men of the Cactus Air Force for months reached the stage where it stopped being a background condition and started being a primary one. Men flew with fevers that would have hospitalized them anywhere else in the world. The island did not offer the option of being sick and resting because the radar did not take days off and the Tokyo Express ran on a schedule that had no interest in anyone's body temperature. Chet Varro had lost 30 pounds since August. The flight surgeon, Lieutenant Commander Aldous Webb, had weighed him and written the number down and shown it to him with the expression of a man presenting evidence in a case he expected to lose. Varro had looked at the number and asked when the next contact was expected. Webb said, "That's not the conversation I'm trying to have with you, Captain." Varro said, "I know, when's the contact?" Webb let him go because Webb understood, as all of them understood, that the mathematics of this island did not bend for human bodies. There were not enough pilots. There had never been enough pilots. Every man who could still walk to a plane was a man who flew, so Varro flew. He flew with the folded paper in his breast pocket every single mission. He did not take it out between flights. He did not need to read it again because he had memorized it after the second reading, and the point was not the words. The point was the weight of it, the specific weight of a piece of paper that a man had written in the dark while the world was coming apart because a job was unfinished and some information needed to be passed along before whatever came next. Through October and into November the count climbed. 14, 17, 21. The Japanese formations changed in a way Varro noticed and Tanner confirmed with intelligence reports. The veteran pilots, the ones who had been flying since China, the ones with the accumulated instincts of years of combat, were not coming back in the same numbers. They were being replaced by younger men who flew with less certainty and died with more of it. A 0 in the hands of an experienced pilot was the most dangerous fighter in the Pacific. A 0 in the hands of a boy who had been rushed through training to fill the gaps left by men who did not come back from Guadalcanal was something different. It was still fast. It still turned beautifully. But it hesitated at the wrong moments. It flinched. The Cactus Air Force was not winning because their planes were better. They were winning because they were grinding down something that could not be replaced. He was at 23 when the orders came. Tanner walked into the operations shack and sat down across from him and did not say anything for long enough that Varro put down his fork. Tanner said, "Webb filed a medical report. It's not optional this time. They're pulling you out on Thursday's transport." Varro said, "Tally needs a lead." Tanner said, "Tally's a good pilot." Varro said, "He's 22 years old." Tanner said, "He was 22 when he got here too." This was true and Varro knew it, and it did not make the thing easier. He said, "I'm not done." Tanner said, "I know," he said, 23. Tanner reached into his breast pocket and placed a folded sheet of paper on the table between them. Different from the one Varro carried, it was a signals intercept, transcribed and stamped from 3 days prior. Varro read it once. It was a Navy Department internal communication, not a commendation, not a press release, a bureaucratic query directed to Tanner's unit asking for verification of kill tallies because the operational record showed an unusual concentration of confirmed victories achieved in aircraft whose maintenance documentation was, and these were the exact words they had chosen, non-standard. Non-standard. That was the term the Navy Department in Washington had selected for planes held together with boneyard parts and soup can metal, and the last repair of a man who had not gone to the dugout. The same department that had circulated the report recommending the Wildcats' withdrawal from frontline service was now quietly questioning whether the record built on that front line, in that plane, was properly supported by paperwork. Varro read it twice. Then he set it back on the table between them. He said, "They wanted the plane gone in October. Now they want the number too." Tanner said nothing. Varro said, Did you respond? Tanner said, I told them the kills were witnessed, confirmed and signed by every pilot in this squadron. I told them the plane was real, even if the paperwork wasn't. I told them the man who kept it flying was buried on this island and his name was Earl Pruitt, and that they were welcome to come down here and tell me to my face that the record didn't count. He picked up the intercept and folded it back into his pocket. Haven't heard back. The rain came down on the corrugated roof. Somewhere on the flight line, an engine was being tested, revving and settling, revving and settling. Varro said, 2 more days. Tanner said, 1. He flew the next morning in the last operational Wildcat on the field. Tally on his wing. The contact was 12 Zeros flying a sweep mission coming down the slot looking to clear the air over Henderson Field. The fight lasted 18 minutes. Varro shot down 2 of them using the same method he had been using since October, the same method that the Navy report had implicitly declared futile. He flew at them instead of away. He used the weight and the armor and the guns. He flew straight and did not flinch, and they broke before he did. The second Zero came apart at 9,000 feet, and Varro pulled up through the debris and leveled off and looked at his fuel gauge and looked at the sky and realized the fight was over. The remaining Japanese planes were climbing back north. Below him, Henderson Field sat in the morning sun, still there, still operational, still the thing that all of this had been about from the beginning. 25, 26, he brought the Wildcat down onto the runway for the last time. He taxied to the revetment. He cut the engine. He sat in the cockpit without moving, longer than usual, until Weller climbed up on the wing to check on him. Varro said, I'm fine, just sitting. Weller nodded and climbed back down and left him there. Tanner came to the wing route. He looked up and said, 26. Varro said, yeah. Tanner said, Eddie Rickenbacker's number. Varro said, I know whose number it is. A silence. Then Tanner said, Chet, then. If you die on this island, the story of what happened here gets filed away and used to justify the next group of men sent out with not enough planes and not enough fuel. But if you go home, you can tell it. And when you tell it for Pruitt. For every man who stayed up all night with a wrench so some pilot could have one more chance to get back in the air. Varro looked down the flight line. Tally was climbing out of his Wildcat 2 revetments over, peeling off his helmet. He looked up and caught Varro's eye across the distance and held it, and then he did the thing with half his mouth. Not quite a grin, just the ghost of one, the version that Guadalcanal had filed down from what it used to be, but had not entirely removed. Varro gave him a single nod, then he climbed down from the wing and walked to the medical tent. Thursday morning came in grey and wet. Varro walked to the transport carrying nothing but his flight bag and the paper in his breast pocket. The transport was a C-47 with oil stains on the fuselage and a crew chief who looked at the state of Varro's face and said nothing, which was exactly right. Varro settled into a canvas seat along the fuselage wall and looked out the small window at the airfield. He could see the boneyard from here, the pile of stripped aluminum at the edge of the jungle, growing throughout these months as planes came back in pieces or did not come back at all. He had come to understand something about the boneyard that he had not understood in August. It was not a graveyard, it was a library. Every part that came out of it and went onto a flying plane was a continuation, was the dead plane still in the air in the only form available to it. Pruitt had understood this without ever needing to say it. He had understood it through his hands. The transport's engines turned over and the C-47 began to move, and Varro watched Henderson Field slide past the window. The cratered runway, the revetments, the operations shack with its corrugated tin roof, the radar shack that had called in every contact, every incoming formation, every blip on the screen that translated into another morning of climbing into something that should not have been flying to meet something that was almost certainly faster and more agile and built by people who had not yet learned to be afraid of it. He watched it all slide past, and then the wheels left the ground and the island dropped away beneath him, and he did not look away until the clouds closed over it. The months that followed had a different texture. Stateside, clean sheets, food that required no identification. Webb had been right about the 30 pounds and about several other things besides, and the Navy physicians who examined Varro in San Diego used words like depleted and prolonged exposure and recommended a recovery period measured in months. He spent part of that time in front of audiences, Bond rallies and civic halls because 26 was a number that translated easily into headlines, and the war needed its numbers. He stood at podiums and spoke about the Cactus Air Force and the men who had held the line on a rotting island with borrowed planes and insufficient fuel. And the audiences were moved and bought bonds and felt the war come closer through his words. But the talk he gave that he meant most was not at a podium. He went to the Grumman plant on Long Island in the winter of 1943, and they put him on the factory floor. He walked the assembly line and talked to the men and women who built the planes. He talked to the welder who put the armor plate behind the pilot's seat. He talked to the woman who fitted the self-sealing rubber into the fuel tank walls. He talked to the man who torqued the bolts on the landing gear assemblies, who looked at his hands while Varro spoke, and then looked up and asked if it really worked, the self-sealing tanks, if they really stopped the leaks. Varro said, "I came home." The man looked at him for a moment and then looked back at his hands and went back to work, and Varro understood that this was what he had come to do, not to address crowds, to say that sentence to that man. He told them about Pruitt, not as a speech, just the facts of what happened. A man in his 40s had stayed in a hangar in the middle of a naval bombardment to finish a repair on a cylinder assembly because the pilot was going to need it in the morning and the job was not done. The cylinder held. Varro did not say what the note said. He did not need to. The workers on the floor had gone quiet while he talked, the assembly line still moving around them, and when he finished, a woman at the fuel tank station turned back to her work without looking up and said, "We'll make sure the next one holds too." That was all. The legacy of Guadalcanal did not fit neatly into official accounts, which is how real legacies usually work. The planes that Washington had recommended withdrawing from frontline service went on to fly throughout the Pacific until better aircraft arrived to replace them. The tactics developed by men who had no choice but to invent new ways of fighting became doctrine. The lesson that the Japanese could not replace their veteran pilots, a lesson written in the skies above Henderson Field by 4 cracked and scorched wildcats flying into formations of 50, shortened the war in ways that no single engagement can be made to account for. Durability is a weapon. This is the lesson that the performance charts do not record, and the Washington reports do not recommend, and the men who flew the tub into the sky over Guadalcanal understood in the only way you can understand something true, which is by living it. Chet Varro came back to South Dakota after the war. He worked the land and raised a family and lived a long and quiet life among people who knew the general shape of the story without knowing all of it, because he was not a man who required an audience for the things that mattered most to him. When people asked how it was done, how 4 junkyard planes and a handful of sick Marines had held the line against the finest naval aviators in the Pacific, he always gave the same answer. Simple and direct and without decoration, the way a man from South Dakota delivers the truth. He said, "We had better mechanics." And he meant it as the highest honor one man can pay another. Not better in the technical sense, better in the sense of a man who stays at his post in the dark because the job is not finished and someone is going to need it in the morning. That is the kind of better that wins wars, the kind that doesn't appear on any chart. The kind that cannot be written off by any department in any building in Washington because it does not exist on paper at all. It exists in the work and in the people willing to finish it.